A palm-sized clay fragment lies under cold light in a museum drawer, its edge cracked through the last line of an ancient myth. The catalog card calls it harmless, a broken creation story, symbolic, damaged. The fracture stops exactly where the god Enki recorded his verdict on humans. Why would decay break a tablet in the one place that mattered most? A second fragment, never shown, may complete the sentence. Nobody working that drawer thought twice about it. Fragments like this sit in every major cuneiform collection, the leftovers of myths copied and recopied by scribes for 2,000 years before anyone in Europe could read a single wedge-shaped sign. This particular piece belongs to a story known today as Enki and Ninmah, a tale about the god of wisdom shaping the first humans out of river clay. It is old, it is well documented. It is, by every official measure, closed, and that is exactly the kind of case file you should be suspicious of. Here is the story the way it has always been told. The younger gods, the Igigi, grow tired of digging canals and hauling baskets of raw earth under the sun. They complain loudly enough that it reaches the ears of Enki's own mother, who wakes him from where he sleeps in the waters below the world. Enki listens and does what he always does. He solves the problem. He designs a substitute laborer, a creature built from the clay of the Abzu, shaped by the birth goddess Ninmah and her helpers, meant to carry what the gods no longer wanted to carry themselves. Later, at a feast celebrating the new creation, Enki and Ninmah play a strange and slightly cruel game. Drunk on beer, Ninmah begins shaping humans on her own, one after another, each one flawed in some new way, and challenges Enki to find each one a place in the world. A man who cannot close his outstretched hands, a blind man, a man whose knees will not bend, a person who cannot control themselves. Every single time, without hesitation, Enki looks at the failed creation and assigns it a role anyway, a servant to the king, a musician, a silversmith, a place for every broken thing, as though he already knew exactly what each flaw was for before Ninmah had even finished shaping it. It reads, on the surface, like a party trick. Two gods showing off in front of an audience, one building problems, the other solving them instantly for applause. That is the charm of the myth, and it is very likely exactly what the original audience heard. But notice what the scene requires of Enki every single time. He does not guess. He does not improvise. He looks once and he already knows the function. A myth about drunken cleverness does not usually need its hero to be quite that precise, quite that fast, on quite so many separate examinations in a row. Mainstream scholars read this the way it presents itself. It is an origin story explaining why disabled and marginalized people exist, wrapped inside a drinking contest between two gods showing off. That is the whole reading, filed under myth, filed under symbolic, filed under solved decades ago. And to be fair to that reading, it works. It explains the humor. It explains the pacing. It explains why the tablet keeps circling back to Enki's cleverness instead of Ninmah's creativity. If you stopped here, you would have a perfectly reasonable myth, the kind that gets summarized in a single afternoon lecture and never thought about again. Most people who encounter this story do exactly that. They read the summary, note the moral, and move on to the next fragment waiting in the drawer. But the safe reading depends on one quiet assumption, that every clause in this myth is doing the same kind of work, that the jokes are jokes, the insults are insults, and the verdict, when it finally arrives, is just one more line of poetry. Nobody tested that assumption directly because for most of the last century, nobody could. The final clause was gone. There was nothing left to test. Then somebody went back to the fracture. The last surviving clause of Enki's reply, the single moment in the entire myth where the god privately evaluates what he has just examined, alone without an audience, is the exact line the tablet lost to damage. Not the opening, not the middle where the jokes and insults happen, the verdict. The one sentence every translator agrees would matter most if it had survived. An independent linguist working from a newer high-resolution scan, decades after the first hand copy was published, noticed something the earlier transcription had missed entirely. A faint extra wedge, pressed just before the break, sitting exactly where a scribe would normally write the ordinary sign for creature or thing formed. This mark did not match either of those signs. It matched something rarer, a determinative usually reserved for a living thing that fell outside the god's own system of classification. Not flawed, unclassified. On its own, that is nothing. Scribes made small mistakes constantly, and a single strange wedge proves very little by itself. But here is the detail that keeps this from being dismissed as easily as it should be. An error is sloppy. It wanders. This mark is precise, spaced with exactly the same care as every sign around it, sitting exactly where a deliberate scribe would place a word he meant to use. The researcher, who first noticed it, did not announce a discovery. According to the notes later shared informally with colleagues, the first reaction was closer to disbelief than excitement. Running the scan again under a slightly different angle of light, checking whether the mark was a scratch, a shadow, a flaw in the clay itself rather than the clay's message. It was none of those. Under raking light at a low angle, the wedge held its shape from every direction a scratch would have distorted. Whatever pressed it into the clay did so on purpose, 3,500 years before anyone would need to explain why. You know how one wrong word can change the meaning of an entire message. Send a text with a single autocorrect mistake, and a joke turns into an accusation. A plan turns into a threat. And nobody can quite explain afterward how one letter did all that damage. Now, put that wrong word in the one-clause history conveniently lost. In a sentence, a god is supposed to be speaking about us, and the coincidence stops feeling comfortable. If this reading holds, and mainstream Assyriologists are right to stay cautious about that word if, then Enki was not commenting on weakness at all in that final line. He was commenting on something present in these newly made humans that had no equivalent among the gods themselves. Not a deformity, a capacity nobody had bothered to name yet. The official explanation still technically survives this. Scholars will point out, correctly, that determinative signs get reused across unrelated contexts all the time, and that one strange mark proves nothing on its own. That caution is fair. It is also precisely the kind of caution that lets one very specific detail sit untouched for years because calling it decorative is easier than asking what it was actually doing there. So the researchers went looking for it somewhere else. They found it, not in another myth about gods and clay, in a completely different kind of document, an administrative fragment from a different city, written generations later, with no obvious literary reason to reference Enki's private judgment at all. The same rare sign appears there too, sitting beside language describing something left unassigned in humankind, something the gods had never gotten around to cataloging. A myth and a bureaucratic record separated by centuries and genres that should have nothing to do with each other, quietly sharing one uncommon mark in the exact same emotional position. That is the kind of repetition a single coincidence was never built to absorb. This is where the safe explanation starts to bend, not break, but bend in a way that is hard to unsee. A strange sign inside a poem is atmosphere. A strange sign inside a dry administrative tablet is a habit. The same strange sign, doing the same job in both, is a pattern. And patterns are the one thing an explanation saying it is just symbolic was never built to survive. The second document does not explain the first. It makes the first impossible to file away comfortably. On its own, a strange sign in a myth is a curiosity. Matched against a second, unrelated genre, it becomes a habit that somebody somewhere kept repeating for a reason nobody wrote down. There is a third place this sign shows up, and it is the one mainstream scholars mention least. Mesopotamian tradition preserves lists of the Apkallu, semi-divine sages said to have brought knowledge to early humans before the flood: writing, building, ritual, the basic tools of civilization itself. In one damaged catalog of these figures, the same rare determinative appears again, this time attached to a description of what the Apkallu supposedly recognized in the people they taught. Mainstream Assyriologists are careful here, and they should be. Catalog texts are formulaic by design, and a shared sign across formulaic genres is exactly the kind of thing that can repeat by convention rather than meaning. That objection is reasonable. It is also the third time, not the first, that this same objection has had to be raised about the same sign. And this is where the story stopped being about one broken tablet and became something much larger. The second document, the one that might complete the missing verdict, was never fully released to the public. A full, high-resolution scan of it currently sits inside a restricted study collection, available only to a small circle of researchers. A preliminary note comparing the two fragments side by side was submitted for academic review years ago and was quietly not accepted for publication for reasons that were never made public either. Nobody had to hide this tablet in a vault. Nobody had to lock a door or burn a report. They only had to mark the comparison inconclusive, return the fragment to storage, and move on to the next drawer waiting to be cataloged. That is how institutions bury an inconvenient detail, not with secrecy, with paperwork, and with boredom. The official reason given, when anyone asked, was preservation. The fragment was fragile. The drawer it belonged to was being reorganized as part of a larger digitization project, and priority went to objects with fewer complications attached to them. None of that is a lie. All of it is also conveniently the exact set of reasons that keeps a controversial comparison out of daylight without anyone ever having to say the word controversial out loud. A closed door explained by paperwork is still a closed door, and the people asking to see what was behind it were quietly told to wait for a review process that never seemed to reach a conclusion. But boredom does not erase a pattern. It only delays who finds it next. Because once you accept even the possibility that this sign might mean an unclassified capacity in humans, the rest of Enki's story starts to read differently. He is the god who guards the ME, the encoded functions of civilization, described in other texts as something close to the operating instructions of the world itself. Powers that are counted, listed, and jealously controlled, as though the gods kept a private inventory of everything that made a society function. He is the god who later, in a separate flood myth, secretly warns a single mortal to build a boat and survive, going behind the back of the very gods who decided the rest of humanity should be erased. Again and again, across an entire cycle of myths, he is the one figure who quietly notices what humans have, or might have, that the gods never accounted for when they first built us. One researcher who spent years working through these overlapping texts described the feeling as reading a technician's notes disguised as scripture. Not because the language is technical, it is not, but because the pattern of behavior, inspect, notice, quietly adjust, keep the observation to yourself, repeats far more often than a simple morality tale would require. Mainstream scholars call this a consistent literary theme, a recurring character trait for one god across many stories, and they may be entirely correct. But a consistent literary theme and a repeated technical observation can look almost identical from a distance, and nobody has ever definitively proven which one this is. This is exactly where alternative researchers push the idea further than the current evidence can support. And it is worth being honest about that instead of pretending otherwise. Popular writers, most famously Zecharia Sitchin, built an entire narrative around this specific episode of Sumerian myth. The Anunnaki reimagined as a visiting people, humans reimagined as an engineered workforce, Enki reimagined as something closer to a geneticist than a god. Mainstream scholarship rejects this reading outright and rightly points out that nothing in the actual cuneiform describes spacecraft, chromosomes, or a foreign planet. That criticism is fair, and it should not be dismissed just because the fringe version happens to be more exciting to watch. But the fringe theory, being wrong, does not automatically mean the sign is nothing. Even if every cosmic claim collapses completely, the tablet still has to explain why its single most damaged line is also its single most specific one. Here is where the mystery widens again, and this next part should unsettle you more than any spaceship theory ever could. Long before any of these tablets were baked in a kiln, on an island with no native wildcats of its own, someone carried a small cat across open water on a wooden boat and buried it deliberately beside a human being with visible care, roughly 9,500 years ago. No temple existed yet to explain that act. No myth had been written down to justify it. The behavior came first, by thousands of years. The story came later, borrowing meaning from something people had already been doing without a word for it. If you have ever watched a house cat stare fixedly at an empty hallway for no reason you can see, you already understand the shape of this feeling. Something noticing a boundary long before anyone had language sophisticated enough to describe what the boundary was actually for. Thresholds, doorways, and the animals stationed beside them recur constantly across later Mesopotamian religion, almost always as guardians standing at the line between one world and another, one state and another, the living and whatever waits on the other side of a door, left open in the dark. Lamassu figures, part bull and part guardians, were carved into the entrances of palaces for exactly this reason. Not decoration, but a functional watch posted at the one point where an outside force could get in. The placement was never accidental. Ancient builders treated the threshold itself as the most dangerous part of any structure, more dangerous than the walls, because a wall keeps something out only as long as nobody opens the door. Put those threads side by side. An unassigned capacity, quietly noted in a newly made species, in the one line a god was recorded saying about it. A boundary creature buried beside a threshold thousands of years before, writing existed to name what it was guarding. A carved guardian posted at every palace door for 1,000 years afterward, for reasons everyone in that world apparently understood without needing it explained. 3 separate traditions from different eras, different materials, and different disciplines entirely, quietly circling the exact same idea from opposite directions. Something crossed over that should not have been able to, and something or someone was left behind to watch the door. None of this proves the alternative reading correct, and it would be irresponsible to claim otherwise here or anywhere else. The official explanation may still be the right one, a myth about human disability, a tribute to one god's cleverness, nothing more sinister than a scribe showing off centuries before anyone imagined this text would be scanned by a machine. But the official explanation was never built to answer why the damage lines up this precisely, why the rare sign repeats this specifically in an unrelated genre, or why the one direct comparison that might resolve the question has sat unpublished for years instead of being tested openly in front of other specialists. What has actually changed recently is not the myth itself. It is our ability to look at it properly for the first time. Multispectral imaging and AI-assisted transliteration are now surfacing marginal marks that ordinary photography missed for over a century on tablets nobody thought still had secrets left to give up after decades sitting quietly in storage. Researchers are rereading fragments that were cataloged as finished business back in the 1900s, simply because the tools finally exist to ask sharper questions of very old, very patient clay. Lines once dismissed as scribal error are being rephotographed under raking light and rechecked against sister fragments nobody thought to compare before. That alone should tell you this particular story is not closed. It has only just been reopened by machines the original scribes could never have imagined reading their work. None of this means the alternative theory is correct, and it would be dishonest to end on that note as though it were. Mainstream scholars will very likely go on treating this as symbolic myth, and in the end, they may well turn out to be exactly right. But even if every disputed reading collapses under closer study, the question underneath it does not go away on its own. Why does the damage sit precisely where the verdict should be? Why does one rare sign keep surfacing in the one emotional position that matters across a poem, a bureaucratic record, and a catalog of forgotten teachers? Why has the single comparison capable of settling the question quietly stayed out of print for years instead of being tested where anyone could check it? Even if the honest answer to all three questions turns out to be coincidence, this specific and this repeated still deserves to be looked at directly instead of being filed away quietly a second time. The tablet is still sitting in its drawer tonight. The catalog card still calls it harmless. The fracture still runs exactly through the one line where a god is supposed to have written down what he saw in us and what he decided to do about it. Maybe it always was only a joke about weak knees and clumsy hands, and the strange sign means nothing at all. But somewhere in a restricted collection, a second piece of clay is still waiting to finish a sentence that began with the making of the first human being, and so far, nobody has been willing to let it speak in full. The label stayed harmless. The clay did not.